Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to part 3 of 3 parts of the Jeffersonian Republic, and the date range for this unit is 1800 to 1816. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and this presentation is going to be about the presidency of James Madison. As I hope you recall, in part 1, we discussed the election of 1800 and some key ideas that stemmed from that event. Part 2 was all about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, was a whirlwind tour through his 2 terms. The presidency of James Madison, the key ideas we're going to talk about there are foreign policy problems, the War of 1812, which is really the big picture event here, the burning of the White House, and the Hartford Convention. So here we go. All right, so James and Dolly Madison. James and Dolly Madison were fascinating characters. We know James Madison. We've heard of him before. We're going to talk about him in more detail. Dolly Madison was a fascinating character. She was a no BS kind of gal, and she was not afraid to speak her mind, and she was highly respected by her husband, namely. And this is no small feat considering the era we're in, because as I hope you are all aware, we're still in a very patriarchal setup. So women they couldn't vote, they didn't have a lot of power or agency, and so for Dolly Madison to really take the bull by the horns and put it out there was really quite impressive. So if you really want to know about power women and learn some more about women involved in politics in the founding, I strongly suggest you do some research on Dolly Madison, because she was good times. So, James Madison is the focus of our presentation today. He was Jefferson's Secretary of State. He is widely considered as the most intelligent of the Founding Fathers. He is known as the father of the Constitution. He won the 1808 and 1812 elections, so he also served 2 terms. And as I said, the big event during his presidency was the War of 1812. Now, here you see a political cartoon, and it shows a boxing match between the King of England on the on the left-hand side, and then James Madison on the other. So I want you to kind of take a look at this cartoon and think about the colors that are used, the actions that are taking place, what's happening. I want you to think about who may have produced this cartoon, from what perspective, for what audience. These are the types of questions you need to ask yourself when you're viewing any source, but particularly a visual source, because symbolism is key here, and it's gonna give you a bird's eye view into what's going on in this cartoon. So this one I want you to think about and figure out on your own. We've got another cartoon later on in this presentation that I'm going to break down in more detail for you. So, War of 1812. Some big picture causes. There's a lot of debate about this, and I'm sure if you watched another presentation or took a look at some scholarly articles or books, you'd find additional or other reasons for the causes of the war. But this is big picture stuff. So the U.S. wanted Spanish Florida. So Spain and England were allied, which is kind of a problem because we're not too thrilled with England at this point. We had the issue of British impressment, which we talked about in the previous presentation in part 2. And British impressment was basically they were taking our ships, they were taking our stuff, and they took our guys. And they basically made them indentured servants for the British Navy. So that's not cool. That was not good times. We were not happy about that. So we wanted to fight back for that. They also failed to vacate the territory that they agreed to vacate with the First Treaty of Paris and also Jay's Treaty, hence why it wasn't very popular. We also wanted to secure a foreign market for U.S. crops. So there were some war hawks. We have Henry Clay. I want you to remember this guy's name. He was Speaker of the House at the time. Henry Clay is going to be hugely influential over the next 50, 60 years or so of history that we're going to talk about. He is a very, very, very big deal. So remember, Henry Clay, he was a war hawk, as in he was gung-ho for war, and Calhoun, who was the leading Republican, okay? He was from South Carolina, and he's also going to be a very, very big deal as we move forward. So here we have the burning of Washington. The war broke out, of course, in 1812. The various battles aren't really hugely important. There's one battle that we're going to learn about in a second that I want you to keep in mind. The burning of Washington was quite a big deal. August 24th, 1814, British marched in and torched the whole place. There are a lot of cool stories about this. James and Dolly Madison, because the war was on, they knew that they had to have an escape plan and get out at any second. What was interesting is that James, the president, was actually off dealing with other issues, so he wasn't at the White House at the time, but he told his wife, he's like, listen, you got to be ready to go at a moment's notice, because they might be coming. So Dolly was quickly writing a letter as the British were coming, again, was quickly writing a letter to a friend of hers, and she said, listen, you know, I got to peace out. The British are coming. I'm going to save the portrait of George Washington because that's most important. I'm going to go meet my husband. She said some other things. I'm obviously paraphrasing. But it was a cool little letter. You should look it up. And she saved the portrait of George Washington. She left all their personal belongings and said, it's most important that I save this portrait because, you know, good Lord, he's George Washington. So here you have some fascinating pictures here that kind of give you a sense of what that event might have been like. So I want you to just take a look at these individual primary sources and think about the types of information that you can glean from these sources. So the burning of Washington by the British took place August 24th, 1814. Now, the Hartford Convention was a big deal, and it is directly connected to the war. Opposition to the war increased as we got into 1815. The war has been going on for a few years at this point. The Americans have had it. We have another war with Britain. Didn't we already cover this in the Revolutionary War? We got to do this again. What's going on? So the New England Federalists met, and then they considered secession again, because of course in 1804 they considered it with Aaron Burr, well, at least a few of the radical Federalists, and they listed grievances they had with the administration. So they talked about secession. The right of nullification was stated, but they kind of had a problem because they decided to do all this stuff after the Battle of New Orleans. So the convention looks really stupid, and the Federalists go bye-bye. This is really the end of the Federalists. I talked about this in some of the previous presentations, but the Federalists are really like in a comatose state at this point. They're basically done. They're on life support. They're not going to hang out for very much longer because they make this big deal about how awful it is and the war's so bad and here are our grievances. And then the Battle of New Orleans happens and we totally knock them out of the water. I'm going to talk about the Battle of New Orleans in a second. This is a political cartoon about the criticism of the Hartford Convention. This cartoon was done by a gentleman named William Charles. It was published in approximately 1814, and I'm going to read from a source from the National Archives from the government. You can find this picture and this description on the federal government's website. Charles's satire attacks the Hartford Convention, which was a series of secret meetings of New England Federalists that were held in December of 1814. The artist caricatures radical secessionist leader Timothy Pickering and lampoons the inclinations towards secession by convention members Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, alleging encouragement from English King George. In the center, on a shore, kneels Timothy Pickering, with hands clasped, praying, I strongly and most fervently pray for the success of this great leap, which will change my vulgar name into that of my Lord of Essex. God save the King. On a precipice above him, a man, representing Massachusetts, pulls two others, Rhode Island and Connecticut, toward the edge. Rhode Island, poor little I, what will become of me? This leap is of frightful size. I sink into despondency. Connecticut, I cannot, Brother Mass. Let me pray and fast some time longer. Little Road will jump the first. Massachusetts, what a dangerous leap, but we must jump, Brother Connecticut. Across the water on the right sits George III with arms stretched out toward the men on the cliff. He calls, Oh, 'tis my Yankee boys! Jump in, my fine fellows. Plenty molasses and codfish, plenty of goods to smuggle, honors, titles, and nobility into the bargain. On the left, below the cliff, is a medallion inscribed with the names of Perry, McDonough, Hull, and other heroes of the War of 1812, and decorated with a ribbon which reads, This is the produce of the land they wish to abandon. This political cartoon is very obviously against the Hartford Convention. It's basically calling the Federalists a bunch of loyalists, basically calling them Tories, likening them to King George. That's the linkage, the implication. The idea is that these Federalists are traitors. They're committing treason against the country of the United States by not acting in a patriotic fashion, by trying to undermine the administration, which, surprisingly enough, isn't so different from what the Federalists accused the Democratic Republicans of doing when they enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. So it's an interesting juxtaposition here between what occurred during the presidency of Federalist John Adams and what is occurring during the presidency of Democratic Republican James Madison. It's an interesting juxtaposition. So, the Treaty of Ghent in 1814 officially ends the war. The interesting thing is it's signed before the Battle of New Orleans, which is considered the last battle of the war. It did not address impressment. And really, there were no changes from 1812. We just stopped fighting. So, again, the United States does not handle the British question. So we're going to have to deal with that again at some point down the line. The Battle of New Orleans was the last battle of the war. Like I said, it was fought after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, which officially ended the fighting. But, of course, hero Andrew Jackson was not aware of this at the time. This is what put this gentleman on the map. He would become President Andrew Jackson during the 1820s. We'll get to him in Unit 6, but remember his name because he's very, very, very important. Andrew Jackson. Nickname Old Hickory, which he got in this battle. There were over 2,000 casualties for the British, only about 20 for us. Biggest highlight of the war, to be quite frank, we cleaned their chronometers. We wiped the floor with them. So, of course, after a big, huge, successful battle, wiping of the floor of the British, that was this battle, the Hartford Convention looks pretty stupid. It looks really ridiculous and doesn't make much sense at all. Hence why the Federalists were pretty much dead after this. That is the end of Part 3, ladies and gentlemen. Good luck studying for the unit exam. Make sure to do those note cards, and I will see you soon.